What is the biggest misconception or overlooked thing when it comes to nervous system anxiety?
I would have to say that, yeah, it's probably this. I think it's that this idea of nervous system regulation, or of cultivating calm, that the end goal is some state of kind of perpetual equanimity, where you just never get kind of like rocked one way or the other. And what I think, and this is especially true with kids, is that actually, in some ways, the opposite is true, where it's more a case of you are welcoming the full spectrum of your experience. And there may be like high highs and low lows, but the point is you don't get stuck there. Like what I define as dysregulation is getting like stuck in a certain state, that causes suffering over a long period of time and not being able to kind of come back to that grounded center within. So I think of like building capacity and resilience. And capacity is like your ability to stay present within intensity, and resilience is how effectively can you downshift after a stressful situation.
Mm. One thing that I really love that you speak about is accumulated emotional debt. And it's kind of what I was hearing when you said that, because I think a lot of people, and I think you were one of them, of course, that's why you got into this work of just suppressing the emotions you don't want to feel. Yet we also don't want to be controlled by our emotions, and we don't want to let them out too much because that can also be a sign of letting them control us. What is that happy medium? How can we deal with our emotions better?
Yeah. So I'd also say that I think the frame of like managing emotions is somewhat of a an unhealthy frame, because to the degree to which we try to control the emotions that we're having, that implies some kind of resistance. And what I've noticed in my experience and the clients I work with is that when it's not actually the emotion that causes suffering, it's the way in which we resist feeling it. And so, the and this has been shown in studies that the life cycle of an emotion is somewhere between like 8 and 12 seconds, maybe 15 to 20 at most. Um, but most people, that's not their experience of emotions. Most people get stuck in these loops, and what's actually happening is they're getting stuck in the story about the emotion and not actually feeling the emotion itself. And so, I have there's many different, let's say, kind of skills to learn when it comes to nervous system mastery. I think of like building internal awareness and interoception, being able to up and down regulate, kind of to kind of be more intentional. But then I think that the biggest piece is this piece around emotions, which is how can you welcome and not resist, and kind of cleanly express emotions as and when they arise. And for sure, there's a kind of way in which context plays a role. Like there are times when it is healthy to kind of repress emotions and save them for later. If you do that all the time, if that's all you do, it builds up this emotional debt, and they come out in kinked ways. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I don't think managing emotions is where I was thinking. I think it's more so I think a lot of us are living in our head. I think you said you lived in your head for like 20 plus years of your life, and so many of us are doing it really unknowingly. And I'm curious, when was it the first time when you realized that, and what was the first step to getting out of your head?
Yeah. Well, so for me, I went through a fairly intense kind of grief process when I lost my former fiance about 7 years ago. And I think that the process of grief was so intense. And gradually, like in the beginning, it was kind of like denial, and there was some degree of numbness. But as I started to kind of thaw, I realized how much was there. And I started getting curious, I think, around like, like I wonder like what other aspects of my emotional experience I just haven't been feeling. Um, but in terms of like a starting point, I think noticing that like we are always having an emotional experience. And there's a fun exercise of like, if I tell you right now, try not to feel any emotions right now. Like like if you just try it right now, there's the only way you can do that is if you like really really tense your body, just like contract and resist, and like almost like you're about to get into like freezing cold water. And so I think it really is a spectrum. And we are always feeling things all of the time. It's more just a case of there are certain emotions that have been labeled not good. And so we construct our lives in order to avoid feeling those, and we bounce up into the head and kind of often get stuck in these repeating narratives to avoid feeling whatever that might be. Maybe it's fear or grief or loneliness, or, you know, it's different for everyone. But I think the way forward is really, for me, it's through curiosity. It's like being genuinely curious, and not from a place of I want to feel this to get rid of it, but more just a case of like what is the actual sensation that is there for me. And to some degree that also requires permission and also safety, honestly, because many of us have learned subconsciously that these emotions weren't safe. Maybe our parents were like mad at us when we expressed anger, or we learned as boys that it was like unmanly to cry. You know, there's all of these stories and narratives around it. So the first piece is just like permission, and creating like a time or space if it's kind of new for you, and yeah, and kind of going in gently and just seeing what's there.
Yeah, this is something that I've been really curious about and excited to talk to you about. The idea of the emotional life cycle is really a few seconds, right? But what keeps it around and what keeps it continuously reigniting is that story that we tell ourselves about it. Is there any utility to creating a story around the feeling that we're having, or like, yeah, I'll ask that.
What do you think?
I think if we're trying to figure out why, maybe, but if we're only labeling it and not actually trying to go to the root, definitely not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think for many people it's very helpful to take the stance of the story in many ways is actually irrelevant. Like, what the experience that you're looking to have is for the body and the nervous system to have a sense of completion around whatever the event was. And that is primarily a physical thing. And sometimes there'll even be kind of reflexes. Maybe the reflex is crying, maybe it's certain movements, maybe it's like, I don't know, like curling up into a ball and like feeling shame. Um, and for me, the narrative is only helpful to the degree that it creates the conditions for that experience and that reflex to be completed. Um, and sometimes sometimes meaning will come through afterwards, and it can be really nice. You know, let's say something big happens and you end up journaling, and the journaling can create a sense of integration. I think that can be valuable. Um, but I think that most people are far too oriented towards the story and far less weighted towards the actual sensations themselves. And I've had very intense emotional experiences that I have no idea what they were connected to. It was just my body was just um, releasing and unwinding in the way that it wanted to.
The bottom up approach seems to be more helpful, but we always try to find reasonings for why we're feeling a certain way. But I think it's affirming to hear that we don't need a reason why, because I think a lot of us are looking for reasons why, which only keep us in that life cycle.
There's an interesting split brain experiment that basically people were able to talk to this lady, the left side of her brain and the right side of her brain, and they like hid certain things that were happening. And basically, what they showed is that even though, let's say she kind of got up and closed the curtain, like her parts of her brain confabulated and literally made up reasons for what she did, because that's just what like our brains are prediction making and story making machines. So they will often make up stories, but I think of it as more like a PR department that's like reporting on some event. They don't actually create the event. They're just like telling a story to make sense out of it.
Yeah. So what you're telling me is that we can't think our way to feeling.
No, and at the same time, I don't want to underplay the value of using the imagination and using visuals to access emotions. You know, I in the podcast I had before this, my guest talked about visualizing himself when he was like 80 years old on his deathbed, and like the emotions that that brought up. And so we can create visuals which have emotional responses. And at the same time, it requires being open to the somatic, felt sense, physical, like raw sensations, and not just the stories and the images.
Yeah, I think both ways from like you is that inner child kind of doing a meditation in that sense. I did that recently actually. The the me as a child and then me right at my deathbed, literally me like about to die. I'm in emotional intelligence coaching, and both were so powerful. And I think looking at both of them to kind of recognize where you are today to make decisions is really impactful. One thing that I've had a lot of somatic practitioners, people that work in this kind of work on the pod, and a lot of them have this through line of therapy, talk therapy really isn't sustainable in the sense that you're talking about things, but talking about things really never allow you to feel those things in a sense.
I,
What's your opinion?
yeah, I'd actually say the opposite. I think it's like incredibly sustainable in a bad way, in that like it will sustain for like 10, 15, 20 years, and you'll maybe gain more intellectual clarity over like the reasons that you have issues or patterns or challenges, but it doesn't actually address the root cause. And I can kind of speak to the theory that I have right now around some of like the emergent neuroscience, but fundamentally there are um, experiences that we had that kind of get, the body keeps a score, that kind of get stored in the body, and the physical sensations and the emotions that were there have to be re-experienced in order for them to be kind of reintegrated into the whole of our psyche.
Yeah, and when I say not sustainable, that's exactly what I meant in the sense that it doesn't allow you to actually get to the root. It's like it's dealing with the symptom to the problem, not the root cause of what caused that symptom. What's the recent neuroscience that you're excited about?
Yeah, it's this guy. His name's Michael Edward Johnson. I had him on my podcast recently. If people want to listen to it, but he has a theory that he calls vasocomputation. The kind of TLDR version is that he believes the mechanism for how trauma is stored in the body is through what he calls latches in the smooth muscle tissue, and those latches are basically tension that get created in moments where the system is overwhelmed, or where it's unsafe to feel something. And I've seen many times in myself and in clients that I've worked with, um, it, tension physically gets released, and like more blood flow and feeling and sensation enters areas that were previously somewhat numbed or tense or constricted. Um, and I think it's very interesting to, if we could measure these, or we could track blood flow in the system, because latches are highly correlated with blood flow in certain areas, that we could say, oh, you seem to have latches here, here, and here. We could do some somatic work and open these up, and then do another blood flow measurement or scan afterwards, and you could see the before and after of somatic work, which I think would be really interesting, because right now it is somewhat it's reliant on subjective reporting of, oh, I feel better, or my relationship patterns seem to have disappeared, or these good things happen, but we don't have the way that we can measure someone's glucose levels or blood panels. And so I think it would be very helpful to actually bring this into the domain of measurable, quantifiable science.
Right there with you. I think it is some of the most powerful stuff that I've done in my life have come from doing somatic work, and I feel it's not. That's why I want to do on the podcast because I don't think it's given enough attention to. Right, like there is no quote unquote metric for I feel better, and we need more like for a lot of people, logical brains, we need more scientific evidence of like this is what happened before, this is what happened after. And I know that you're a big bottom up approach guy. What are some of the things that we can do to on our own and maybe even to get into that somatic work so that we can do the work for ourselves?
The kind of three categories that I briefly mentioned earlier that I think are kind of the foundational skills to learn are, firstly, physical body awareness, which is known as interoception in the technical term, and that can look like doing body scans, either if you have like a morning meditation practice, kind of having the meditation practice being just being aware of your body. I have an acronym I call APE, which stands for awareness, posture, emotion. And you can just be like, how is my awareness right now? Like, is it expanded? Is it contracted? How is my posture? And then is there any kind of emotional tone present? And just asking that question over time, you'll kind of build more like high resolution about your internal experience. And over time, you'll be able to bring that into conversations, into when you're at work, and you kind of just develop more interoceptive capacity. Um, the second is this idea of self-regulation, which I think of fundamentally as like being able to uh, return from a kind of triggered or reactive state into a state where you can be intentional and present. And again, there's a component of interoception here because you have to have enough awareness to realize when you are in a kind of contracted or reactive state. And then there's a series of practices that you can do, um, depending on how much time you have, depending on the context, depending on where you are, that bring you into this state of basically grounded presence again. Um, Often people will disassociate, or it's maybe worth mentioning, there's like two directions that people can be reactive in. One is hyper arousal, which is kind of like anxiety, overwhelm, anxiousness when there's almost like too much energy and you can't be present. And then the other is hypo arousal, which is more like the emergency handbrake gets pulled and there's like collapse or shutdown or withdrawal or numbness. And they're both on a spectrum. So people can be 5 out of 10, 10 out of 10 on those. And learning practices for noticing when that happens and then coming back into a place of feeling grounded and connected again is a really, really useful life skill. And it just allows you to, and again, here, progress doesn't look like never being reactive again in your life, because unlikely. It's more of like, how do you reduce the half-life of the reactivity? So going from it being like, for some people, it might be 2 weeks, down to 2 days, down to 2 hours, down to like 2 minutes. And then the third category is the emotional work, which it sounds like you're somewhat familiar with, can be really helpful to do with a somatic practitioner, with a guide, if that's available. If it's not, then again, it really comes down to just being curious about your sensations and following them, and actually just like exploring what unfolds when you just give your sensations and emotions space and you hold them in curious, loving presence, which sounds kind of woo, but it's really just a way of orienting to your usually, I don't know if you're familiar with the internal family systems, but usually there's a part that feels exiled or feels like it's unsafe, and it's basically bringing. Well, there's a kind of trend that I love around ideal parenting or like reparenting, and you can literally imagine like a kind of ideal father or mother figure, and just like imagine them being present with this part of you that feels like afraid or feels scared or whatever the feeling is, and bringing some sense of regulation to that part is kind of what it comes down to.
Love Richard Schwartz's work. IFS is incredible. I think everyone, like your work, his work, so many other people's, like this is what we should be learning as children, so we can go into the world with so many more actual tools. His perspective, and I don't remember which one I read of his work, but um, man, it was incredible, and it was like it really like put pieces and parts of myself together in a way that it made so much more sense. I also had a intergenerational trauma therapist from Colombian, I think last year, and she brought in this idea of, I've always been someone that hums a lot just in my day-to-day life, and I didn't realize that that's actually healing me in a lot of ways. And she brought that up, and I know that that's something you talk a lot about as well as breath work and all the things. What are some tactics that we can do to kind of get our nervous system, I wouldn't say under control, but like you said, get that half-life back into place?
Yeah, so humming's great. Humming's amazing. You can either do it. There's a like VU hum. The VU is like more. You kind of feel it down more in like your belly and your chest, and then the hum is kind of more up in the face and the head. You can amplify it by. There's a yogi version where they put their thumbs in their ears and then 2 fingers over the eyes and 1 finger over the nose, and it increases the vibrations in the sinus cavities, which releases more nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, which creates more of a downshifting calming effect. So humming is amazing. I've actually just created a card deck of 45 different like somatic practices that people can try. There's practices around, one is self-havening, which is basically just like giving yourself kind of like caring touch. And you can kind of do it by like putting your arms in front of you and just like it's like stroking your forearms basically, and just bringing a sense of like presence. Other practices I like are there's one called 3-2-1, which is you name basically about bringing yourself back into your senses. Like when we get reactive, we tend to actually like disassociate from our sensory experience. And so 3-2-1 is three things you can see, two things you can hear, and then really important one thing you can feel. So might be like, yeah. And the feeling one is particularly important. Usually it's good to do with your hands or your feet. You can also even just now like bring your, if you're listening, you can like bring your awareness and your attention down to your feet and like feel your feet on the floor. Maybe almost imagine that like gravity is like 10% stronger and there's just like a sense of like heaviness, and that also can be regulating. Often when people get anxious, their awareness tends to be like up here, and it can be really good to bring it down. And then there's some really interesting awareness practices where most people don't realize, but you can like play with your awareness. Like you can, right now, my awareness is kind of like fairly kind of focus in front of me, focus on the screen, focus on you, but I can like be aware of the space to the sides of me, and then the space like behind me, and the space above me, and the space below me, and it creates this like spaciousness. And in that spaciousness, the body tends to naturally just relax. There's like less tension. And when we get stressed and reactive, the awareness goes down to like a straw. And a lot of people are kind of familiar with that sensation of where they like only focus on the thing right in front of you. And that's useful in certain times, but most of the time we want to have our awareness be much more expansive. And it's also it's used in acting training. Interestingly, people appear to be more charismatic when they have this expanded awareness. So there's other benefits to it as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that I've talked about for years is the actual real quality of just going on a walk without headphones, because a lot of us work inside. I don't know many people that work outside. And so our awareness is so enclosed to the room that we're in, the house that we're in, having, terrible lights on us. And then you just going outside for a walk, getting your body moving, you feel the awareness of the ground, you feel the awareness of yourself about around the world. It just feels so expansive, because when you're in one enclosed space, you feel like you have one specific problem, or you're consumed by your problems. And then you look around the world and you go outside and you're like, wow, everyone is living their own experience. And it just helps you expand that awareness and realize how insignificant you are in the best way possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's also some, you can kind of add to this in the sense of there have been studies done, I think it's called the cathedral effect, where the height of the ceiling that someone's working in actually dictates how creative they are. Generally, the higher the ceiling, the more creative and abstract thinking they do. And you can, the extreme version of that would be like you're going on a hike, you see the kind of horizon of the ocean, there's this sense of expansiveness. And that makes intuitive sense. But like you say, most of us spend our times in kind of small enclosed spaces. Also, the quality of light makes a difference. Like getting only kind of low quality, like junk light, as some people call it, versus natural daylight and sunlight is really bad for our kind of mitochondrial systems and can create kind of energy scarcity in our body. So yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't need to preach to people the virtues of being outside, but it's helpful.
Insanely helpful. I spent about a little bit over 3 months on Kauai last year in Hawaii,
Oh, beautiful.
and I did
Yeah.
not wear shoes for 3 months straight. And it was the best experience. I've never felt more grounded. And that's another example of just like not only being outside, but we're always wearing shoes, we're always wearing socks, we're always in, like, we're inside a lot of the time, and we don't really know what it truly means to be grounded. And this goes into something that we spoke about right before this, of anxiety. I think a lot of people just live in this low level ambient anxiety, and they don't even really know what it feels like to be grounded, or um, have their nervous system regulated. What do you think are like the main factors to anxiety nowadays?
Yeah. I want to firstly talk about on the grounding piece. There's also some really interesting research from my second favorite neuroscientist, this guy, Dr. Michael Levin, another Michael, and he's researching the impact of bioelectricity and how basically our cells are constantly communicating through this language of bioelectricity, and both how our environments with EMFs and RFs are being quite disrupted, and just the yeah, I think it's such an underlooked and underappreciated area of biology. And in some way, I think the experiments he's running will likely redefine many of the fields in modern medicine. Anyway, that's another brief aside, but Dr. Michael Levin is fascinating work if people are interested. But yeah, in terms of anxiety,
Do you know of Clint Ober? I think his name is. I don't remember the name of his book or his documentary, but he wrote so much on like reigniting ourselves and all the things like that through grounding. His work, you'd be fascinated if Michael Levin is up your alley.
yeah, I know Dr. Jack Kruse as well as written. He's more controversial. I don't really resonate with his style, but he has a lot of interesting ideas as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, coming back to anxiety, yeah, so I've been thinking about this recently in terms of I think of anxiety on two axes. One is how stimulated is your system, and then the other is how much tension or constriction is present. And I think what's challenging about anxiety is that there can be so many different causes and also different sources. Like if I drink 10 cups of this yerba mate, I'll probably start to feel what some people would label anxiety, or five double espressos. Like there's just so much stimulation in my system, and it's very hard to be present with that, right? Um, and then on the other side, there is tension and constriction. And I think the metaphor of a hose pipe is quite useful. If you imagine like a hose pipe that gets kinked, it will basically create anxiety. And often that tension, like I was mentioning earlier, is a way in which we constrict against an underlying emotional experience. So I don't think of anxiety, sorry, as an emotion. I actually think of it's like a protection mechanism against feeling underlying emotions. And so there's a couple of approaches you can take. One is incorporating more downshifting practices, also breathwork practices that have an extended exhale, where the exhale is twice as long as the inhale, is a naturally kind of calming, or breathing deep into the belly with some resistance against the belly as well is another really good one. So you can either like decrease the amount of stimulation in your system, or more effectively, do some of the more kind of emotional exploration practices to see like what is the anxiety protecting me from right now, like, and often like someone will know, like there's a sense of like, oh, I'm afraid of that thing, or I whatever it is, like there's almost always like someone will know what the thing is. And then it becomes a question of like, okay, can I like welcome this, and sometimes even just acknowledging the fact that there is like an underlying thing, it brings compassion into the system, which creates a softening and an ease. um where people really get into trouble is when they start to develop an anxiety or a fear of the sensations of anxiety itself, because that creates this kind of negative feedback loop that ends up in panic attacks sometimes. And so again, like really getting curious, and there's even some interesting practice where you can almost like just focus on the sensation and be like, can I like enjoy this? And it sounds weird, but in the same way that like I don't know, like sexual experiences can be quite intense. If you view of like, can I really like relax and like open up into this? It's like the energy gets to like kind of fill your body, and it's not constrained to like a specific part of your body. Um, so really, I think anxiety is such an interesting area because it is so prevalent, so widespread, and it has many different root causes for people, but it's also a great gateway into deeper self-awareness and emotional exploration.
Yeah, I can hear the IFS through your just the way that you speak. And, and I agree on that as well. I think it's really difficult to see this as something that is happening for me in the moment. But if you're able to have that awareness to recognize it and see what is this teaching me, what is this pointing me to, it can be really, really helpful to have that awareness. And I think as well, I think you've done a 10-day, have you done a Vipassana retreat? And you've done some darkness retreats as well?
I did, yeah, it was 10-day retreat and then 10 days in a dark room.
I think a lot of people think those kind of retreats will leaving with this like pure emotional freedom, and it probably is for a temporary period of time. But what did those experiences teach you about, creating that emotional freedom for yourself?
Yeah. Um, you know what? I think so. I've been on many extended meditation retreats. They all have different flavors for me. I think what came through for me during the darkness retreat that was really powerful at the time was I remember it was like on like day 5 or day 6, and yeah, I'd been like meditating for as many hours a day as I felt like I wanted to. And at some point, this like deep intrinsic happiness just started like flowing through me, and I just started smiling for no reason at all. I just like couldn't stop smiling. I was like so fucking happy. And it was such a beautiful it was so beautiful because there wasn't any reason for it. And I think that I kind of had the story for a long time of like, oh, I need a reason to be happy. I need a reason to be joyful, happy. And I think what the realization was that this deep sense of like almost like ecstatic joy is actually my default state when I'm able to just like relax and fall back into it, which was such a beautiful reframe because it's like I don't need to do anything in the external world, like whatever business success, whatever relationships I have. Like, sure, they can bring me joy. That's great. But it's actually that deep, 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 deep joy is there all of the time. And that was a really beautiful thing for me to kind of take away. And it created a kind of anti fragility, maybe as well, of like, no matter what happens in life, if I can just like spend some time alone with myself, I can find that deep joy again. And it's a powerful thing.
Yeah, it is. We have so much attachment to things or achievements that we feel that I it's like great example here is you work online, right? And for most people they're working online nowadays. And so they feel as though I don't physically feel tired by the end of the day. So I have to emotionally like drain myself to the biggest extent to feel like I deserve whatever is coming into my life. And I think that that belief, holding that belief that like you're inherently joyful is so powerful and not many people hold it. Do you think the darkness retreat was the had the biggest impact on your emotional freedom, or was it a specific thing, or was it just kind of an overtime kind of thing?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'd say that actually breathwork practices and specifically FBR, facilitated breath repatterning, was much more what created emotional freedom for me because that practice is almost very much designed to elicit the kind of deeper, stuck, repressed emotions that I had many of growing up in the UK. And I think, honestly, all of us are carrying some degree of that. I think for me, meditation was more, yeah, maybe more around expanding capacity for joy, also training my attention and being able to, um, yeah, like cultivate a kind of intensity of presence and sustained attention. Um, and I've really been getting into jhana practice. I don't know if you come across this. It's essentially these guys, now friends of mine. They have a startup called Journey, Journey, and within 2 to 3 days, sometimes they're able to teach people to access these jhana states, which are essentially positive feedback loops between attention and emotion, and creating um, panic attacks for joy is another way that they talk about it, where just intense levels of bliss and rapture that then kind of, as for me, I experience it as like very intense bliss kind of up in around my head area, then like deep love and compassion in my heart area. And then as it goes further down, it becomes more just like complete equanimity and stillness and like deep okayness is maybe the best way to put it. And yeah, again, that practice has been really beautiful for just like, starting my day from that place and reminding myself that I don't need to do anything in the external world to feel really, really fucking good in my body. Um, and it's definitely tied in with the emotional practice as well. I think that um, there's a way in which joy becomes inaccessible when there's an emotion present that we're unwilling to feel. And so in some ways, in like when I'm not able to access those states, it's usually an indication that there's some kind of emotion that I've skipped over in the last few days that, or some part of me that is like requiring attention.
Yeah, I think you've talked about incomplete reflexes in past podcasts as well. That kind of goes hand in hand with that. Like we're unwilling to feel those emotions, maybe because we have this internal belief that it's bad to be angry, or it's bad to be sad, or it's bad whatever it is. And I think a lot of us hold this belief inherently that we are bad, like just as humans, just inherently. how do you make space for that for yourself? Is it a weekly thing, a daily thing, or just when it pops up?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's maybe worth first double clicking on the incomplete reflexes kind of phrase. And maybe the best way that people can like get a visceral sense of what this is if you Google or YouTube, I think it's like bear shaking after being shot by a tranquilizer. There's another video of an animal that is I think it's an impala that's chased by a lion and it escapes, and then the video kind of pans to this impala that's crouching under a bush, and it just starts to shake, and it shakes intensely for like 2-3 minutes, and once it's done, it kind of gets up and just continues. And that is the impala completing that mobilization reflex of like it was almost about to die, it survived. Once it found safety behind the bush, the threat was away, it could shake and just complete that reflex, complete that mobilization stress. And so, as you can imagine, as humans, we are, we're not actually at risk of dying, but our physiology thinks that we are. So we're kind of in this state of like intense stress. But if we're not able to fully metabolize it and feel it all the way through, it gets stored. And that's what creates that emotional debt that we kind of spoke to earlier. But in terms of how to make time and space for that, it's a really good question. And I'll start by acknowledging, like, for folks out there, especially parents that have kids, people that have 9 to 5 jobs, it's really hard. Like, it is hard to find kind of meaningful time and space for it. For me, for a long time, I did like a weekly breathwork practice where I kind of guide myself for 60 to 90 minutes, usually on weekends. Now it's much more of like, if I notice there's an emotion in my experience that I'm resisting or that I'm like afraid to feel, I'll be like, I'll just prioritize it, because I know that like anything else I try and do will be to some degree negatively impacted or tainted by that. It'll be hard for me to feel fully present or relaxed whilst that's still in the background. And I think, for people that are wondering what the hell we're talking about, working in person with someone is really, really helpful. And that was for sure, I think, probably essential for me in the beginning, of having someone to guide me through, because you can really, like, you literally co-regulate with someone, and you're like borrowing nervous system capacity and safety from them for a period of time. And with practice, you learn to feel safe to do it yourself. But I'm a big fan of doing it either in small groups or one-on-one with kind of attuned guidance from a practitioner. And I'm a fan of Hakomi, somatic experiencing, FBR, breathwork, conscious connected breathing. There's many different approaches, but it is very helpful to have someone there with you. And at the same time, you can kind of still like have a lot of beautiful results from just doing a little bit of like internal parts work of like identifying, okay, there's a part of me that feels scared. How can I bring 10% more compassionate or loving presence? Like, oh, I'm noticing maybe I want to cry. Can I like soften the part of me that feels tense? It's really about, actually, the common thread here is like noticing where there's tension or contraction in your body. And it's like, can I just like relax into this? Can I soften into this? And then eventually you'll kind of, oh, right, I feel some tenderness there. Okay. And you just kind of keep following that. And then at some point, an emotion will come through, and you'll know it's complete, because you'll feel a sense of like expansiveness and freedom. You'll be like, oh God, like there's this like deep exhale on the other side that feels really, really good. And that's a sign that you've completed whatever that, and there's always going to be more. It's like layers of an onion, but it comes in waves, and our body, I believe, only kind of brings up emotions or intensity that is proportional to what we can handle.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think in person, like you said, is so powerful, because you're, like you said, you're borrowing in such a way. And I think too, the environmental design is something that you've talked about previously as well, where when you're surrounding yourself, and I even think environment, not just the people or the area, but like the place on earth that you're at. You grew up in the UK, and then you did or several hundreds of breathwork sessions in Bali. How has, like, do you notice a difference in your nervous system or having anxiety in, like, depending on where you are in the world?
Mm, yeah, it's a super interesting question. So I definitely notice if I'm in a city versus a kind of rural nature place, obviously. But yeah, I mean, now, like, my wife and I choose to live in Santa Cruz. We're going to be moving to Costa Rica. I find that I'm generally much happier when I'm in nature. It sounds obvious, but for sure, there's just a low level of like background activation in busy urban areas. Um, and there's also, I mean, the kind of a really helpful frame that I think is worth sharing is we're kind of constantly tracking and co-regulating with our environments. And if our environment is overhead blue LED lights, loud sounds, kind of sharp edges and surfaces, it's kind of sending a lot of cues of like lack of safety. Um, and our body is always tracking like how safe is our environment. And you really do need to create in the psychedelic world, it's set and setting. But where setting is like how safe is your environment? And so if you go and do a journey with someone, like these rooms they'll have kind of soft amber lighting. They'll have like relaxing music. Maybe there'll be some like lavender scents, all of these things that create that sense of like, oh, like, okay, I'm getting all these cues. This feels really safe. I can relax. And then when someone relaxes, that's when things start to arise. And I think the reason that a lot of people struggle to connect with their emotions is because there literally aren't any physical spaces or moments in the day where the body just feels safe. So they're in this consistent chronic fight flight state and they don't know what else to do.
Yeah, I don't think we think about how our external environment is almost like food in a way, right? Like the food that we eat is going to impact our internal environment. Just like I've noticed lights. Like for me, I only want windows open. I really don't enjoy lights in any capacity, even if they're, a little bit more orange red, like I'll take it. But any kind of LED or anything of that sort, just it I don't feel good. And I think and recognizing that is a really big thing. Where in Costa Rica are you going to? I was in Costa Rica, I think last 2 years ago now, which is crazy. And I think a lot of people are seemingly moving there.
Yeah, we're going to a place called Nosara, which is on the west coast. Yeah, my wife and I want to start a family and raise a kid in community, so we're buying land and doing the whole wholesome living thing.
I'm excited for you, man. It's an amazing place for a lot of people, especially people that are focused on this kind of work, that's for sure. I'm curious, like, as an actionable step for people, what's a small, subtle habit that has had maybe the biggest or a big impact on your nervous system?
Mm, there's so many. I think for almost all of this, I think it was like downstream of awareness for me. And so really paying attention and noticing how my nervous system was reacting as much as I could during the day, like in different spaces, in different places, in different conversations, when I was doing different work projects, in different cities, and really being attuned to how the instrument of your human nervous system is being played by different environments and different spaces. And once you start to notice that, then you can bring in certain practices or interventions, or let's say like wearing blue blockers after the sun goes down, and notice like how you feel versus how you feel when you don't necessarily. Um, because without that, you can kind of blindly introduce experiments, but if you're not sensitive to the difference that it makes, it probably won't stick. So it's really about coming back to your own experience and yeah, kind of like following what feels good for you. Um, and then that combined with this idea of um, yeah, like for me, it all comes down to the emotional component and work and realizing that there's no such thing as like a negative emotion. The only thing that sucks about it is the way that we resist them and learning to love grief or even shame or abandonment or helplessness. Um, that is, I think, ultimately what creates like true freedom. And there are very helpful kind of health biohacky things that people can do. Like I have a red light, I have blue blocking glasses. I try and get as much sun as I can during the day. Try and get my feet on the ground. All those things. They're for sure helpful. But yeah, I think like the true nervous system transformation comes from reframing our relationship to the parts of ourselves that we otherwise habitually ignore.
100%. When I learned about IFS, it was the first time when I thought like I can actually love the shame that I have for myself because there's a protective part of me that's like, it's doing its job. I can hate it, but it's not gonna do any good for me. And like you said, that resistance is really the core behind all of our unhappiness and our emotional dysregulation. All of the things is just comes from our resistance to all of the things that are happening in life. It's like reality
Mm,
is or happiness is reality minus our expectations. And the same thing goes with the emotions we don't want to feel. It's just like if we didn't expect to feel good all the time and we allowed those feelings to happen as they should, I mean, I think we would just have so much more just fluidity to all the things that are happening. You've worked with so many people, like in many different ways. What's the commonality you notice in people that is holding them back, and what do you think is like the one thing that most people need to be doing?
what's the commonality of what's holding people back, and what's the one thing that people need to be doing? Um, I'll give like a somewhat controversial answer to the first part.
Nice.
I think that there is a way in which the way that they're relating to this work is actually holding them back. And I think that the self improvement paradigm and industry, frankly, is actually doing a lot of people a disservice because it is making the implicit assumption that something within you needs fixing, that you are in some way broken, and that if you do X, Y, and Z, you will be fixed. And that actually perpetuates the issue. And so there's another frame that this Gurdjieff originally, but Steve March is a great philosopher. He calls it self unfoldment, and it's basically starting from this premise of like, what if nothing is wrong, and then exploring from there. So I think that a lot of people can get a lot of mileage from, and it also just engenders more compassion as well. So I think it's actually in some ways less about the practices and more about how are you relating to these practices and what subtle agendas do you have for yourself. Um, because yeah, like I really believe that like the body knows how to return to homeostasis, the nervous system has inherent wisdom. It's more of like, how do we get out of the way?
It's so funny you bring that up right now because the podcast I released this morning was on how self help is ruining your life, like that
Hmm.
approach. And
Yeah.
is with a self improvement YouTuber that has got out of that space because of that. Like the idea of being productive and all of these different things. I mean, like we're coming from a good place, but the approach in itself is inherently not good. And
Mhm. Mhm.
it's I need to fix myself. It kind of goes back to what you said earlier of like I am inherently worthy of joy. I don't have to do anything. I'm inherently good. And I think when I was speaking with Seth Godin 2 years ago, I think now he talked about this when it relates to marketing. Is like marketing is really just selling people on the thing that they're supposed to need to be enough, to be complete. And I think the same thing goes with anything in self-help is like we're just being sold on the idea that we're not enough and this thing's going to make us enough.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
unfortunate that it's that way.
Yeah, yeah. But I really think there's a lot of mileage in like exploring your relationship and your deeper motivations for whatever the practice is. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, one last question before we ask every guest. I think a lot of this work and a lot of just in general is we think we need to take on more, we think we need to do more, but I think my approach that I really am continuously evolving into is that we just need to unlearn a lot of things that are holding us back from, becoming that best version of ourselves. And so my question to you is what belief are you currently unlearning?
Believe me, I currently am learning. Hmm. Interesting. I would say that there's a way in which, so I'd say the belief is that um, I need to create and kind of go through life in like lone wolf mode. So I think I've kind of had like some degree of success and good fortune in playing the kind of solopreneur game, and I think I'm increasingly interested and just notice that I have more fun when I'm like collaborating and playing with other people. And I think there's a way in which, again, culture kind of glorifies self-reliance and hyper independence, and there are virtues in that, in being able to be comfortable in your own company and comfortable in your own skin. And there's a way in which it also holds, I'll say, speak from first person, it holds me back from greater intimacy. And so I think I'm exploring that as a lens and leaning more into community and friendships and making things together.
Dude, I love your work. All this conversation was awesome. I love everything that you're putting into the world. I think it's more needed than ever, and I'm so glad that you are someone that's putting it out into the world. You have a lot of things going on. Where can we direct people?
Yeah, thank you, man. So the best place is probably my website, which is nsmastery.com. And on there, there's a link to the State Shift app that I've created. There's a self-assessment that's free. There's like an email course, and there's the cohorts that I run. Just kind of teaching the stuff. And then also the Curious Humans podcast, which is having conversations like this with people that I enjoy spending time with. And I just want to add that like I wish that I'd had the level of like self-awareness and emotional maturity that you have for your age. Like you're in a really good place. So I love what you're doing, and yeah, stoked for you, man.